Welcome to the Regen Ag SA podcast, the podcast where we chat to people who are making a difference in moving agriculture in a direction that understands that soil has a whole lot more to do than just be a medium for growing our food. People who understand the full ecosystem function of soil. People who understand that change is required to on-farm practices to improve soil health and ultimately soil function. These people come in many forms. They are farmers, consultants, researchers, scientists, academics, financial people, food makers, and retailers. And all are required for this change to take place. We call them regenerators. It is critical that we start regenerating across the whole food supply chain. But it all starts with the soil. Regenerative agriculture starts with the regeneration of the soil-plant ecosystem, the relationship between plants and soil microbiology. My name is Andrew Ardington, and I'm the host of the podcast. Regen Ag SA is privileged to work with these pioneers. Regeneration is the future of agriculture, and we need to be hearing what the people who are making these changes have to say. For decades, soil has been considered merely a medium for holding plants, while plant nutrition and plant health have been provided for with bought-in chemicals. This soil as a medium model of food production is economically unsustainable at farm level. It is also environmentally unsustainable. I'm looking forward to learning how we can change to a regenerative system from these regenerators. And productivity and water is a major issue in all of our lives. In episode 2, our first regenerator, Gavin Olsen, is back for another round. And today we're going to talk about water and more specifically irrigation, its effect on plant nutrition and plant performance. It's something that we need to focus more and more on as it becomes more and more scarce, and also it becomes more and more impacted by man's activities, and the quality of it declines. But the other aspect of it is the cost of water and the cost of getting water, the energy. Think Eskom, think higher costs, and how all of this is going to impact on farm production going forward. So Gavin has been working with irrigation systems for years, and his consulting business in horticulture has gradually moved to where he focuses almost entirely on irrigated lands. And not only is he doing consulting there on the horticultural production, but also on irrigation systems, and he supplies equipment for monitoring soil and water. So welcome again, Gavin.
Thanks, Andrew. Great. Thanks very much. And thanks to the listeners for the good response on our first attempt. I think we've set a bar, so we must just keep getting good quality out there for the listeners.
Yeah, well, I think this is going to be an interesting conversation. I've had interesting conversations in the past with you about water. You've opened my eyes to a few things. I think one of the things was that, I really had never thought about was the advantages of being at the top of the river rather than at the bottom of the river. And, it's pretty obvious if you're going to be drinking the water yourself or ultimately giving it to your livestock, but it's pretty much as important, you say, when it comes down to crops.
You'd apply yourself, and it's worth doing it. But once you've finished with that, you understand the dynamics that are going to designing a good irrigation system. But the system is just there to deliver water, and obviously how you use it and over time is the thing that's going to drive the efficiency and obviously the extension of your resource. Your water, that you're the limited or finite amount you might have on your farm. The interesting part is, over the years, having looked at how we try to improve fertilizers and all of that, it really came down to that 80 or 90% of our problems were farmers were either overwatering or they were watering in the correct, the frequency of irrigation was incorrect for the type of soil they had, with the type of plant they had. Generally, the hydraulic calculations are done correctly by most engineers. But that biological factor, that variable of how does your plant do in your soil, in your given micro or macroclimate, mesoclimate, is very much it's a trial and error situation. You put it in and you start measuring and monitoring and watching the plant grow. You find people adapt their system as it goes. So it's not a perfect science in that you get it right every time, but the measuring of the amount of water that you put down is critical, because I mentioned last week, but a farmer can be putting down anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 tons of water per hectare, depending on the crop. So that's 12 million kilograms of water. We probably only use 1,000 kilograms of fertilizer at the most, and a really heavy synthetic farming practice. So your ratios of the influence of the fertilizer, or the whatever else on the hectare, your water alone, from a center pivot, the droplets itself cause more compaction than the tractor tires do, because of the weight of the water hitting that 12,000 tons, hitting the soil in that droplet form. So getting it right with water is, in my opinion, between 60 and 80% of most irrigated farmers' success. And some of my really top growers that I work with that are always getting good yields of, they do more or less the same fertilizer practices as the guy next door, but their water management is absolutely precise, and as good as they've got to understand it on their farm. So water management is very crucial to an irrigation. I always say the two things that are very dangerous for an irrigation farm is a bag of fertilizer and a green button on the pump. To start it, because it's easy to start it, or you have a computer that starts it and you're still having your cup of coffee and the pump's running, and that's fantastic. That's modern day and age. But like someone said, even with an automatic car, you still got to drive it. You don't might have to change gears, but you've got to be behind the steering wheel. So you have to you have to consider that it's a wonderful tool, but it can also be a really, really big setback if you don't get it right.
Yeah, so in terms of that, the mineral component, do you actually work out when you're doing a water analysis, like especially microminerals and that are being added by that irrigation, and add that to the soil sampling?
Yeah, so if you took, for argument's sake, if we could divide it up. I mean, we have some growers that do grow in substrate, like cocoa peat, or your intensive horticulture. There we would we would obviously have a zero value from the soil, and we would take all of what's in the water and use it as added to the nutrition program. So if, for argument's sake, you needed 100 parts per million of calcium, which is 100 grams of calcium on 1,000 liters of water, and the water had 14, we would only need to add 60 in the form of fertilizer to achieve the 100 that we want. So for sure, you must take that into consideration. Some places we calculate, if I take the Lowveld, I've just come back from there, I was there for 3 days now. We have waters there that have 80 to 100 parts per million of magnesium in the water. Now, normally you can grow most crops with only about 30 or 40. So we have 3-4 times the level. But when you do that calculation over the 8,000 cubic meters a hectare, that ends up being close to almost 2.5 tons of magnesium per hectare per year. So if you likened it back to a bag of magnesium sulfate, which only has 100 grams on a kilogram, it would be 10 tons of magnesium sulfate in the bag form that you've actually applied.
Wow.
So, that's, if you took the price of magnesium now, it's about 4,000 Rand a ton. That's 40,000 Rands worth of magnesium you're putting down. So if you don't take it into consideration, not only does it end up causing negative effects on other, fertilizer competition in the soil, it does have a market effect on soil quality, soil characteristics. And that goes for every element. Too much of, like we said last week, is anything is bad. So taking the water analysis we get from the laboratories, and our labs locally are excellent. All of our local labs for water testing are very, very good. And farmers must differentiate between a microbiological analysis, a water for irrigation, and also when they want to fertigate. So irrigation type analysis will tell you the very basic, it's an intensive analysis, but it gives you some basic parameters on, if I irrigate with this water, my steel pipes are going to either erode or my drippers are going to block.
Yeah.
So it gives you a more or less an indication of what's going on. But if you had to mix fertilizer with that, then it's a different kettle of fish. And that's why there's a specific fertigation test. Most of the labs offer that. We've got some really good labs. I'm not going to mention all of them, but there's quite a few good local labs that do good analyses. You ask for that. So when you look at the mineral content, you have to factor that in. So you need to look at your projected water usage, and then from there you say, okay, well, I don't need to apply magnesium. So when we obviously formulate magnesium fertilizer programs for growers now in the Lowveld now, I have 0 magnesium in the product. There's no magnesium added whatsoever. but lots more calcium, lots more potassium, because those are being, being challenged in the water, through the water on the soil, just purely because of the water quality. And then, I mean, in those chemical indicators as well, I mean, a big one is obviously the pH, or the acidity or alkalinity of the water.
It's very important that you're going to be impacting the balance of a soil. And so you've got to take that into account. So historically, I think there was a lot of over irrigation done before we had the ability to measure. And there's still a lot of irrigation going on now without probes in the ground and without measurements. Aside from the real cost that irrigation is now in the system with the cost of energy, what are the other disadvantages, the negatives from having too much water being applied to a crop?
Oh, obviously, wastage of money and energy is right at the top of the list, and then the resource itself. But if you're in a sandy soil and you over irrigate, you leach nutrients out, so you'll end up with a plant. We've seen it classically in the center pivots in the Sunveld here on the west coast that are doing potatoes. If a pivot pump keeps running, because the center pivots work. Some of them have hydraulically driven wheels that work with the water flow, but others have an electronic one. So the gearbox keeps moving electronically, and when it gets to a certain point, the computer switches it off. But the pump, which is kilometers away, keeps running. So in this one area, you have a profuse amount of water being put down, maybe for 10, 15, 20 minutes before the pump switches off. And on a center pivot, the outer hang of the center pivot can have a precipitation rate equivalent to 200 millimeters of rain an hour.
Wow.
So the outside of that pivot just goes gold and yellow because all this fertilizer gets washed away. So leaching is one thing on sandy soils, and then when you go to soils that are slightly heavier, that hold more moisture, like a clay type soil up to 45%, and you over irrigate on it, you expunge all of the oxygen out of the soil. And roots love to go where there's oxygen. They don't necessarily want to go where there isn't oxygen, because they need oxygen for the microbes around their root and their rhizoplane or the rhizosphere to exist. And because they're mainly predominantly aerobic species. And then the other is a lot of oxidation reduction reactions take place chemically in the solution. So we need oxygen at the root zone, and that's the up and the downside for it. So this whole dynamic of measuring the soil, plant, and water continuum on a continuous basis is the challenge. So it's a critical thing to understand how that interaction works, because you have deep-rooted plants that draw water from deep, like a large nut tree. Then you have citrus, which has a very shallow root system. So you've got to know where you're measuring, and then also where you're placing the water. So it's a real, it's an engineering science, but you've got to get it right. In that, once you've got all of your parameters correct, where you place your measurement instrument is crucial. And then understanding that data, and then from that point saying, okay, I need to separate the bottom 600 of my soil and the top 300, and I focus on the top 300 measurement for giving fertilizer and keeping the tree happy. But as soon as the bottom 600 starts to show that it's plummeting, I need to give a deep, long irrigation to build the subsoil up, the reserve. So every small incremental amount that you don't switch the pump on, or you irrigate 15 minutes less, that accumulates over the 200 odd days a year that you might give water. It accumulates and eventually ends up in a saving. And I've had clients that do large citrus here in the Western Cape, and putting instrumentation like this in, they had a 2 million cubic meter listing. So that's a lot of water, 2 million cubic meters. It'll keep most towns going for a month or two. And this citrus farm, we reduced the water usage on their water meter at their pump house from the Misverstand Dam. We reduced it like down to 1.4 million. So we saved 600,000 cubic meters. So when you multiply that by the cost of power, you immediately see it. But the major difference was on the yield, because when you over irrigate, you obviously expunge all the oxygen out. You have lower biological activity, and you have a reductive environment. So nitrogen becomes inefficient. And so when the soil dries out again, that's why your wetting and drying cycles drive biological activity. As soon as the soil dries out, there's more oxygen ingress, the bacteria come to life again, and then there's more nitrogen release. So that natural natural sort of wetting and drying cycle you get in the ground is what you also try and mimic when you are driving. When you're driving sort of growth in a plant, you need it to get wet and dry. Now, how far that is and how long that is all about the measurement. So you get that right. You can really use your irrigation system and its measurement and the management thereof to make your fertilizer more efficient, specifically the big one, nitrogen. And again, over irrigating, you leach things like potassium out, which is diabolically expensive.
So you mentioned the soil plant water continuum. Just expand on what that is.
If we look at soil as a magnetic field, and I push a plant into it, this plant is now directly perpendicular to the magnetic field. So the stronger the soil, we can say the more the torque. It's like an engine on that plant. And the stronger the soil, it means the more available nutrients, the more nutrients there are, the more water can be stored. Inevitably, you have a stronger plant. Sandier soils, you tend to need to be able to supply everything in solution. You can still achieve a very good yield, a very good growth rate, but you need to be able to give the amount that it needs on a daily basis without over irrigating and leaching and under irrigating and not performing. So you have very nice soils like soils with a medium amount of clay in it, and that's your bucket. All right, now I've got a sandy soil. This bucket is 5 liters, but my clay soil, the bucket's 20 liters. Now I put a plant into it, and amongst it is some roots and some air, and I now have to measure the height of the water level in that bucket. So my bucket is my soil, but the water in it can go up and down.
Mm-hmm.
The plant will absorb what it needs to absorb. It'll take nutrients, it'll multiply cells, it'll grow bigger and bigger. Its water demand increases. So we have what we call a crop coefficient in agriculture, and we take weather parameters. So we're now measuring the climate and what the plant experiences above the ground. We're taking the growth stage of the plant. So when it's small, it needs less water. When it's mature with full fruit load, it needs more water. So we dynamically connect those two in a algorithm, and then with that, and we then measuring what's going on in the ground. So if the plant has got a high water demand, it's at a mature stage. My bucket is very, very low, and there's a high demand for it, and the weather is telling me that it's going to be really warm. I have to give large amounts of water frequently to get that tank back up to a point where the plant doesn't experience stress. Because when a plant experiences hydric stress, it immediately shuts. The leaves start to get too warm. It shuts its breathing pores down, the stomata, which are on the underside of the leaf. These are little holes through which water vapor dissipates, and it creates a suction effect out of the soil. And once that system shuts down, the plant starts to heat up, and then you essentially get sunburn, plants wilting, dying, etc. And that you obviously don't want to have happen. So the soil plant water continuum is the flux. It's the change of the amount of water in the soil the whole time, and of course the fact that the plant does grow, or it comes out of dormancy like an apple tree, and there's small amounts of root hairs. Then there's a huge root flush, then a smaller one, and then a bigger one. So the biomass under the ground increases and decreases, and so you need to plan your irrigation accordingly. And that's really the soil plant water continuum. We have even more advanced measurement technologies, like from UC Davis in California, where they actually have sensors that go into the stem of trees, and it can measure just the amount of pressure in the stem of the tree. So we call it plant water potential, stem water potential, sorry. And so even very refined ways of measuring the water. But the soil plant water continuum is where you want to be measuring the amount of water your plants are using, and that's really the secret to trying to either save water if you want to. I learned from a very experienced farmer. He says you can't really save a plant water, and I asked him, well, why do you say that? Well, he says because when it needs water, you must give it water, but when it doesn't need it, don't give it to him. So I said, well, it sounds just like a child.
Yeah, and you can't achieve any of that without some fairly sophisticated measurement equipment.
Well, no, look, I've growers that don't have. It's all about management size. I mean, if you've got the likes of like ZZ2 or the Cirrus fruit growers, or these guys have got thousands of hectares to cover. You need the data collation coming to an individual and then ground truthing after that. But we've got farmers that have got maybe just 20 hectares of crop, and they have capacity. They don't have electronic measurement instruments. They've got tensiometers in. The tensiometer is a highly effective measuring tool, as long as you're doing something. But you see a reading, you've still got to ground truth it with your farmer, a knowledge of getting an auger out, drilling a hole in the ground, feeling the soil, looking at the subsoil, and saying, okay, what I've measured and what I see correlates. And that's part of a farmer's practice. So having the technology, and we often had this before in the farmers' days, before we started to improve this electronic reading, because we did make some mistakes in the beginning. All of us did in the industry. Is that I'd say, well, who's got a soil moisture probe? And just about everyone in the audience puts their hands up. And then I asked them, well, who of you trusts the probe? And puts their hands up. I said, well, I'm glad that's the case. And they were shocked when I said it. I said, because your instrument gives you an indication or like an Afrikaans tendens of what's going on in the soil. You need to ground truth it. So knowing your farm and going to each place, kick the sod, dig a hole, is still imperative. You'll never get rid of it, but it does free up your time to be able to focus on other highly costly inputs on your farm. But what we have achieved with this type of electronic measurement is certainly we've saved water. There's no doubt. I mean, on farms where we put probes in, we save water 30-40% in the first year alone. It's the biggest bang for buck a farmer can get.
And then a subject that I've, as I said earlier, that I found interesting from talking to you is coming to water quality and what we've done in terms of erosion and pollution, and whether that pollution is stuff from urban areas, concentration of sewage, or whether it's runoff from farms in terms of fertilizers and chemicals, etc. All of that's going into our rivers, our water systems, and it's not rocket science to go that's going to impact you when you take that water out of the river. And then another side to look at is also getting water out of a dam and degrees of oxygenation from stagnant water, sitting water. Yeah, so if you could tell us a little bit about that and your views on that.
Well, yes, look, Andrew, water quality is I think we all know from the media and stuff around the country, because of some infrastructure collapse. We have a problem with raw effluent going into some river systems, and we see the problem at Hartbeespoort Dam, etc., which everyone's trying to rectify. But you need to solve the problem at source, and that's a bit more complicated. But the water quality is certainly, I mean, in some rivers, we have our Water Research Commission, I don't know if Dr. Felix Reinders is still involved up in Pretoria, but himself and his team up there do phenomenal work. I mean, we have one of the most comprehensive water atlases in the world, of South Africa. We've literally mapped every single water catchment area and basin really properly, and into which water use association this water is depositing. So if you look at an area like East London, for argument's sake, the tomato growers there have got a colossal problem in that there's a herbicide used in controlling alien vegetation, which is highly successful. The problem is all chemicals have what we call a KOC coefficient, and that means its ability to adsorb or stick to clay or to the organic matter in the soil. So the lower this coefficient, the more soluble and the more the product runs and ends up in aquatic systems. Now, some compounds are harmless, but obviously they degrade with time. Some of these other products are what we call forever chemicals. Now, those guys have been irrigating, and all of a sudden, with a working on water program, 10 years later, those tomato farmers have got a colossal problem, because this specific herbicide is a hormone weed killer. So the top of the tomato plant looks like something from a Frankenstein experiment. It's twisted and gnarly and looks terrible, and you think it looks virus. You cut the plant down and it grows out again, it gets to a point, and then it starts to show the same symptoms. So, that's a chemical that's leached through the profile. Obviously, we could encourage the working on water program to use a different product. That would be a good thing to try and do. But the problem is this water is now contaminated, and to try and clean it is very tricky. It's not as easy as people think.
Yeah.
So having said that, on that side, the other was, I spoke to a researcher who's looking at the Groot Mariku and a couple of other rivers that flow north out of Pretoria, Rit or Spruit River or something like that. I forget the name, I apologize. But I mean, he said to me, we will harvest the damage of COVID-19's hand sanitizers for 60 years, because the amount of chemicals he finds in river systems is shocking. It's alarmingly high. And of course, that's eroding the biological, the bacteria, because it's obviously a bactericide, a lot of these sanitizers. So all of this has ended up in the water. So water quality, what I'm just getting is water quality is degraded. It's eroded horribly in our country. And sometimes the erosion on the quality is more around the chemical nature, the pH. There's more salts in the water. But the other is also chemical contaminants and biology. Now, the upside of regenerative farming is that if you're going to be building organic matter, there's one thing that you could put anything through and it'll absorb 99.99% of everything, is a carbon filter. Carbon will absorb and hold on to stuff that doesn't belong in the environment. All your nasties will end up in there. So if you build organic matter in your soil, you inevitably end up with a bigger buffer for all these nasties. Getting rid of them obviously is the wiser thing to do, but certainly building on your soil health and your soil organic matter content will help, specifically with the water that has a problem like this. And then the biological side of it is obviously unwanted bacteria and viruses and things in the water that end up being dumped onto your crop. And the more a water column can stand and the less it flows, the more chance you have of having this soup that just boils, and as nutrients come in, they just multiply, and they become more and more. So you see farmers with dams that look very healthy after a winter rain or after the rain period, and then towards the end of the season, their crops are just horrible because the water quality just drops off. So water quality is absolutely everything, and understanding that from the water analysis, if you have a high salt load in your water, not only is it putting stress on the plants, you're now putting down a whole lot of biology that might be anaerobic, and it's going to be stealing oxygen from the soil. So there's a whole lot of things that come with the water quality that one doesn't always, it's not at the forefront of your mind. It's not in consideration. And I think I mentioned to you last week in our first podcast that we spoke about, we've observed that farmers with the best water quality just inevitably have the best biological data back on their soils, are in a far better condition, more regenerative or progressive, not in a survival mode, any of them. So it's it is true that water quality is something that if you can fix and clean your water cost effectively, go for it. As a farmer, some farmers it's not possible. I've got plants on the Orange River that are pumping 1,000 cubic meters an hour. It's 1 million liters an hour of water. To try and clean that, you need specialized equipment that's cost effective. And there is technology, but it's obviously, does it justify being put in? And then getting to the oxygenation, Andrew, there's some rules of chemistry about how water is soluble in oxygen. And as a default, most water has around about 4 milligrams per liter of oxygen in it. If you pressurized the water, in other words, water is not compressible, but air gases are. So you can get more gas into the water. So you can pump oxygen into an irrigation line and get more air into it, or an oxygen concentrator, or you can put products in that break down like peroxide to oxygen. But when that water leaves the emitter or leaves the nozzle and it goes back to the default atmospheric pressure, all of that, just like you pour a beer at the bar on a warm day, the amount of bubbles that come out the top because the carbon dioxide is expanding, it's coming out of the beer quickly, it's not in the keg anymore. Same principle, all of the oxygen expunges out. So farmers get sold this idea that they're going to get more oxygen into the soil. That's an absolute nonsense. They will certainly, if they've changed their soil structure and they've reduced their bulk density of their soil and they have more pore space, have more oxygen in the soil, yes. But you're not going to get more oxygen in the water than the chemical default. And the colder the water is, the more you can get in, but only the fish really benefit from that. So, but it's important that whoever grows working with it, that if the person involved, the advisor, doesn't have a thorough background on water, that they get hold of someone at the Water Research Commission or someone from SABI, the South African Irrigation Institute, that have got very knowledgeable people that can help understand where the limitations are on each person's water. And then there's lots of methods to fix it up, but again, it's at what cost and how much it's the capital investment is.
Yeah, so the logical question is when is that economically viable? I mean, you talk about that example of 1 million liters on the Orange River, and you're going to have to set up a sort of town size water filtration plant in order to deal with that. At what stage and on what crops is it viable to try and improve your water quality once you've got it out of the river?
So if you look at what do you need to clean in the water? So first, the analysis is going to indicate, well, I've got a high organic load. So let's take the Hartebeespoort Dam for argument's sake. We all know about the E. coli and the massive amount of raw effluent that's gone in. So their problem is not so much maybe an acidity problem. Their problem isn't about too many salts in the water. Their problem is a biological load. And so the biological load means we have to kill off these bacteria. So how one's going to do that is by obviously adding something to the water that can neutralize it. So most people look at things like peroxide, or they look at ozone. And then when you look at something like ozone's, I mean, at the right levels, it's 2,000 or 3,000 times more powerful than chlorine. So it's really aggressive oxidizer, but you've got to have special equipment to manufacture it. And its calculation on how many grams or milligrams of ozone you need per hour is the capital expense. That's on the equipment. So your water analysis and the volume that you're going to be pushing through, and it's one of those tricky ones. Obviously, the more the volume, the more cost effective per gram of ozone. Then they're able to sterilize that water. But a lot of people find it prohibitively expensive because it needs someone to manage the system. And again, it's the salaried individual that has to manage it. So it becomes a problem in that aspect. However, if you're irrigating it on cut flowers or you're irrigating it on lettuce, which has to be consumed by people, then cleaning it for your market is imperative. Then you need to do that. If you're producing seed potatoes, where you need to have a very, very healthy, clean spud taken out for the farmer to produce for table potatoes, then you need to clean that water to that level. Otherwise, you're just going to be farming, in a backward. We won't go forwards.
Yeah.
So cleaning at Andrew is very much dependent on the type of industry involved. If you tell me it's a maize farm or a wheat farm, it's going to be pretty difficult to clean it for that level of. But again, you have other things in your favor there. Maybe you have rotation, you have regeneration, you've got manures, you've got all kinds of other things where the biology can really break down and utilize and neutralize and stabilize everything. So that's the one scenario. Other scenarios where you might want to sterilize the water using ultraviolet light, that's also highly efficient. But it is a question of you've got to filter the water thoroughly. There must be no suspended solids in the water. It can be done. I've set up and helped been involved in a couple of systems. The one is at Dubai Trade Port, where we sterilize water there for recirculation in the hydroponic system, and it's very effective. But it was a couple of 100,000 rand for the outlay. But once it's in, it's a very low maintenance. It's a very low maintenance type of water filtration or cleaning system. But those are the two main methods. And then obviously chlorine dosing or peroxide is what people use sometimes to clean the water. But those are consumables. And they are effective. But obviously when you start getting to larger volumes of water, then you need to look at some sort of permanent system to clean the water.
And then in terms of borehole water and using that, what are your main problems that you're looking at there, and any chances of alleviation?
So borehole water is a big plus. I mean, if I was lucky enough to farm on one of the strongest boreholes that were ever drilled here in the Western Cape. There's a famous family here from the Brackenfell area, JJ Moore and Son. They've drilled lots of boreholes here, and The old man told me, I think he clocked that borehole at about 250 cubic meters an hour, and he couldn't drain it. It was just a huge amount of water. So unbelievably low salt quality, but it had iron in it.
Yeah.
So I would have to pump it into a dam, aerate it, oxidize the iron, let it settle out, and then I only sucked water from the top of that dam again for. So that's how I got the iron out of my system. So I had one dam that was purely for settling iron out. A lot of that along the west coast you find. You go up north, and the boreholes, like in Petersburg, Polokwane area, there, got a client there. They drill down and massive amounts of water, but salt load, high magnesium in the water, lots of bicarbonates, high pH. So they have chemical issues. But the thing about boreholes, that water has been through, it's been through millennia to get into that rock and where it is now. It's generally free of contaminants. So that's its big upside. The downside is the cost of pumping water. For every 10 meters you need to lift water, it's 1 bar of pressure. Yeah. So if you had 165 meters or 123 meter borehole, you need a 15, 16 bar pump. So you're talking about 33 kilowatt motor. It's about 35, 40 rand an hour to run that pump just to get your water out. So if you're only getting a small stream out, then it's not good. So when you find a strong borehole and you see your water quality is slightly on the marginal side, it's about understanding how you need to adjust your fertigation structure, how you need to improve your soils to a regenerative state, that it can absorb that little bit of water parameter that might not be perfect according to the ag science world. But it's certainly going to help us be able to farm a piece of land and use the water we have there and still make a reasonable profit out of it. If you've got water sometimes that are just too salty and you've got clay soil, it's an absolute no-brainer. You can't do it. It's going to be a recipe for disaster. So there are limits to everything, but certainly we've had some experience interacting with growers that have got really dubious quality water and are pulling off very nice harvests. So tomato growers, if the water has salt in, the tomatoes are sweeter. In other places, we have to add the salts to it to make the tomato sweet. So there's some crops that can tolerate. Lucerne, for argument's sake, is not, if the pH is high and it's got salts in it, it really, once the lucerne plant is older than 7 or 8 weeks, it can handle salinity, and then they grow and they rehabilitate the soil beautifully. So if one looked at even a rotation system on how you manage that, you can farm with water that's not 100% top quality, but at least if you've understood the limitations through a good analysis and you've taken its interaction on your soil and then you measure the quantity that you need to put on properly, you can manage it quite effectively.
Very interesting. And then in terms of the salinity, in terms of irrigation, how much of a problem are we seeing with that?
So interestingly, my colleagues and I, we worked with table grape farmers down near Piketberg on the Berg River. For the rest of the guys in the country, the Berg River runs from Franschhoek and goes out at Port Owen. So it's about 270 k's. And in Franschhoek, the water's pH is 4.7.
Yeah.
And it's crystal clear. It's got no salts in it. It's literally got only maybe 100 grams of salt, maybe in 1,000 liters of water. Very little parts per million. And when it flows out at Veldrift into the ocean, the pH is close to 10. And the salt load is high. It's in the between 4, 5, and 600 certain times of the year. And that's because this river has coursed its way through Paul Wellington, out through the Swartland, out down past Piketberg, through parts of the Sunveld and into the ocean. It has gone through a large area where, with wheat being grown on broad acre, one of the choice fertilizers used is urea. Yeah. And unfortunately, it leaches quite a lot. And some years when you have high rainfall, this urea ends up in the Berg River. Urea causes the water's pH to elevate, so it becomes alkaline. And that's where you get the pH increase. So to give you an idea, from a pH of 4 to 10, that's 60,000 times more alkaline. So it's a really colossal jump. You end up with a water quality that has now built up more salts in it. So we've been monitoring that over the years with soil tests, etc. And my colleague one day picked up on table grape farms where he saw the yield decreasing. And this started around about 4 years after we built the Berg River Dam. So I'm not against dams. We need dams to where they're wisely thought out and put up. I believe they make a positive contribution to everyone. But when the Berg River Dam was put up to prevent flooding in the Paul Wellington, this whole valley area, obviously beautiful estates and stuff were built because there's no more floods coming. But what we did realize is only a small amount of water is now let down out of a continuous stream to keep the river, at a specific level. And what we did start to notice is the salt buildup. Slowly but surely, the salt's built up. And if we didn't mitigate that with applications of gypsum and some organic soil amendments, speciality products that we put through irrigation to help open up the soil to leach out the salts quicker, you would have seen a continuous regression in the production of these crops. So once we rehabilitated, they started to pick up again. And it's the Berg River quality water that caused that problem. I mean, now last year we've had this last winter we had, I think the Berg River Dam displaced its volume, not the Berg River Dam, sorry, the Misverstand Dam displaced its volume 4 times in one winter. So now we've washed all of the salt down. So you'll expect the crops to look good for the next year or two. So there's a lot to be said about water quality. The same happens in the Lowveld. As you go down the river, towards Komatipoort, Malalaan way, the pH goes through the roof and the amount of salts in the water just increases. And that's all the runoff from the sugarcane lands that's ending up in the river. So a lot of eutrophication that takes place. And if you don't measure that, and so I'm measuring it for growers at the end of the road, and I'm saying, well, look, guys, you've got some fertilizer for free here. Let's take it into consideration. It is true that if we were able to all practice a little bit more regeneratively and apply slightly less fertilizers and have a healthier organic fraction in the soil, then you'll probably find that it'll still be a scenario, but it'll be less of.
Of course, with water, a major thing is the resource becoming more and more scarce, and the competition. There's some very interesting things happening right now in Northern California. The fights over the water in the rivers. Is it for the salmon fishermen? Is it for the towns, or is it for the farmers? And this three-way triangle that's continuing there at the moment, as enormous amount of water has been taken out of those rivers and used for agriculture and for cities, and really impacted the entire zone. And so going forward, one of the major contributions potentially from regenerative agriculture is to improve efficiency of water use in orchards, for instance. Can you just talk a little bit around that?
Andrew, if we talk about orchards, I always say it's good to differentiate between something like an apple, pear, plum, stone fruit, and something like citrus. The cycle of a fruit tree is probably a good 6 months, whereas a citrus tree is growing 12 months of the year. Give 2 or 3 months of the year in the Western Cape, it might not use a lot of water because of rainfall here. But in other parts of our country, we've planted them in dry, arid regions. They're using water all year round. So they're consuming a lot of water, and try to be efficient with that. One has to be very conscious of where you want to be with regards to yield. Now, if you're trying to chase a high yield every year, then your water use efficiency is probably going to look very good. But you might find that you have quality issues because the more you chase it, the more fertilizer you have to give. So you've got to first ask yourself as a farmer, okay, I need to achieve a certain amount of offtake. My contract is X amount of citrus I must deliver. Then these are the amounts of hectares. Now, if you're stretching your water limit to the nth degree to try and achieve that, you're running a really risky scenario, because there are years where you might have to irrigate 2 or 3 months longer, and then you've got too little resource available. Now, the law says in the Water Act that you can't transfer water rights from one farm to the next. The only time it can be done is for human consumption or animals. They come first in the row. You can't do it for crops. So the fight over who owns the water, I mean, water belongs to everyone. In Spain, they say agua para todos. Water is for everyone. And the question is, yeah, man can't live by bread alone. He needs water. So it's good to be able to irrigate the crop to eat the bread, but you've got to have some water with it. So I think if one looks at the amount of water and you look at it pragmatically, the amount of water that a city or an area consumes, a town, is minuscule in comparison to a large-scale irrigation farm. It's just a fact. If you take, for argument's sake, I did a calculation on waste treatment waterworks here, our local municipality. Their total amount of wastewater they push through a day is 18,000 cubic meters, which is 18 million liters of water. So there's a very, very nice golf course around this area. I'm not going to mention the name, but it's an upmarket one in a private estate. And it uses around 12,000 cubic meters of water a day in the height of summer to keep all its greens going.
Oh.
So our entire effluent that flows into the waste treatment walks is almost this amount, same amount of water they put on just on maybe 20 hectares of land. So the water usage as per se for crops is certainly the highest of everything. So any effort we can to save it is, it's important. When do you want to save it? People are trying to save by giving little bits all the year round. And that's why the measurement thereof is important. If you want to achieve the best, we've seen now that we don't even bother fertilizing and giving water on some of our crops that come out of winter dormancy in the Cape. We don't bother until the end of September, October, when our soil moisture probe shows the temperature has increased to 15 degrees, and we see some decrease in the soil moisture. That means the plant's root system is now actively starting to absorb moisture out of it. And then only in sort of first, second week of October do we start slowly giving small pulses of water. And so we build this up until a point where we're able to give the right amount of water the plant wants. So that cycle, but that ability to be able to adapt your measurement to each season, because each season is different with regards to the weather patterns, then you will certainly become more efficient. So the general rule of thumb is that you take your tonnage and divide it by the cubic meters per hectare, and then you get some frights. If you look at something like beef takes, this is now in feedlot system, not in free range. It takes around about 55 liters of water to make 1 kilogram of beef. One orange is 40 liters of water. That's the entire, you can look it up, the water footprint of things. Yeah. Things like mushrooms and chocolate. Chocolate has an astronomical water footprint because the amount of washing and cleaning and stuff. So all the water being used in the process. It's important to be able to bring that down.
In terms of the soil's capacity to infiltrate water, to hold water, to release water, and there's some very interesting experiments both by scientists and by farmers in what they've been able to change in that regard. And surely going forward in the future, it's going to be crucial as water becomes more and more scarce, that we need to be able to produce food using a lot less water.
Yeah, Andrew, I mean, there's wonderful data out for every 1% of carbon organic matter in the soil. You're able to hold something like 340,000 liters of water per hectare.
Additionally,
additionally. So that's a huge, obviously in most soils, the organic matter in the O horizon, as we refer to it, is only in the top 10 millimeters. So the idea is to be able to get that organic profile to represent a larger portion of your soil. If you took it as a side cut section, a cut through of your soil. Now that migration of organic matter down is dependent on the type of organic load we get at the top and how we decompose that and how it moves down. And as your root systems colonize more and more of the soil, and you're able to make sure that your soil is managed properly from a bulk density point of view. So liming ratios must be correct. Looking at, obviously, cover crops play a colossal role, getting things that have a deeper root penetration to get organic matter down deeper and faster are certainly things that immediately adjust the amount of water that you can actually get into the soil. And also, infiltration is actually ironic. You bring up this point. We, as a group, one of the first products we ever registered in South Africa, I'm not going to mention the name of it, but it's designed to flocculate soil and increase water infiltration. And it works in a very unique manner. in only constructively improving the soil colloidal structure. So we've noticed that that product, when applied, has a market effect on the water use. We can see the probes data spiking deeper down within 7 days of applying it. And still to this day, Andrew, it's our leading sales product because water infiltration is a problem everywhere.
Yeah.
It's a really, really big problem. We need water to ingress into the soil at a sufficient rate per hour so that it can suck air with it. So when water stands still, there's no air movement into the soil. So one of the first things that one looks for is to not so much hydrophobic soils. You get soils that are hydrophobic as well. That has to do with different things, or different characteristics of the soil. But certainly most soils that have a nature to be sealed off. There's no ingress of air after the water has moved into the soil, is where you have disease-inducing soils, where soils that are there's always root rot or there's some sort of disease there. So water infiltration's a really, really big thing, and farmers do ignore it. They see it, they don't think it's a problem. They throw something down, some gypsum or something, and they think the problem's solved. But once we start measuring it with a soil moisture probe, you clearly see that you need to do a little bit more than you think. But I mean, that's a big zone for return on money invested. I'd rather do that than a million other things, because the more water I can get my roots access to, the better.
Yeah, and there was a study done in the California almond fields where a regenerative farm that had cover crops and chickens, and it infiltrated 6 times as much water as the neighboring conventional farm. And you would think that here we are in an area in the world, that California Central Valley, where there's droughts after droughts. They have got a huge water problem. There's this conflict between different water users, that a farming practice that results in 6 times the water infiltration would be rapidly adopted across that region.
Yeah, it is. And again, we spoke in our first opening podcast about changing practice. Those are the things that one has to just have a really long talk to the farmer and say, look, this is such a critical input.
Yeah.
Is there no way you can find a way of, we saving you? I use this approach with my growers. I say, right, I put a probe in, I've saved you 35-40% of your water. Can't you just give me 10%? And I'm going to ask you to run the pressure higher so that the droplets spray a little bit further over the ridge in between the row. And on the ridge, on the side here, I'm going to put in a row of ripper radish. These big daikon, they're massive, big Japanese, it almost looks like a parsnip.
Yeah.
And it grows into the soil and it opens the soil. We don't dig it out. We leave it there. It rots, decomposes, and it forms a lovely cavity in which then air and other things can end up, helping to get water deeper down. And so the water moves down deeper, the roots go down deeper. You end up with just a colossal improvement. The guys did it in California, I know, through personal experience and communication, that they just put this ripper radish little seed box 2 times, and they ripped it down either side. And those 20 rows of almond trees were they were just like high yields, better water use efficiency. There was a whole lot of pluses. There were no minuses, actually. But getting the guy to hook it up to a machine and put it through the orchard, and an extra few rand on seed or dollars, is sometimes for a farmer not an issue on 2 hectares or 20 hectares. But you've been to California and you've seen some of those guys, like forget the name of the farm. I think it's Panorama or one of the Paramount farms. I mean, they're the biggest almond grower in the world. They removed 10,000 hectares of their 40, I think, just to help with their water problem.
Yeah. No, there's a situation where they're pulling out the mature trees because they're using too much water.
Too much water, yeah. But it's also because California is dry and hot. And it's a lovely article. I don't know if you watched it, Andrew, on National Geographic, the Great Water Heist of California. If you get a chance to watch it,
but I can imagine.
Watch it. It's got an incredible. It's a very it's actually quite it's quite a political wrangle. Actually, it's not. There is an agronomic drive and there is a water conservation drive behind it. But the dire situation they found themselves in years ago was because of a political situation.
Yeah.
But water quality in our country is something that I think a lot of farmers face. We have it. But one farm in East London who does tomatoes. I mean, he cleans his water up. Yes, he does so much work with it. He chlorinates it, then he flocculates it, and he does this with it. And really, when the water comes out, you could bottle it actually, and that's now his water. And his tomatoes are always quite disease free. He has the odd insect problem here and there, which we have all over our country. But generally, his plants are disease-free. Whereas you go to another grower pulling his stuff out of the Berg River here locally, there's always a sick plant. There's always something, and it's all coming in through the water.
Well, Gav, I think our time is up. Once again, hour just flew by. But thank you very much for giving us your time.
Yeah, we'll look for another topic if the public out there, the farmers out there want some information or more information, any questions, they can, go through Regen Ag platform and contact us, and we can try and put them in contact with some experts in their area. We've got a network of colleagues in and outside of our network that we work with that they know what they're doing.
Yeah. No, well, thank you very much. And look forward to chatting again sometime in the future.
100%. Yeah, we'll choose another topic next time, just not rugby.
Okay.
Cheers, thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you for listening to the Regen Ag SA podcast, the podcast where you get to listen to the regenerators who are building our future. I hope you found it an informative use of your time. Please subscribe to the Regen Ag SA YouTube channel to be notified of new podcasts.